in-laws threw me a pity party when I lost my job. They didn't know I owned the building they lived in. The party was Sandra's idea. Of course it was. She'd been waiting 3 years for a moment like this. Some visible crack in my foundation she could press her fingers into and call concern. She set it up in the dining room of the house where my husband Daniel grew up, the one with the yellow curtains she'd had since 1987, and the cabinet full of Daniel's childhood trophies that she dusted every Sunday like a small private religion. She made her pot roast. She used the good plates. She invited his Aunt Carol and his brother Pete and Pete's wife Renee, who had the specific talent of agreeing with everything Sandra said while maintaining just enough distance to later claim she'd been neutral. I sat at the head of the table they'd set for me, with a glass of sweet tea I hadn't asked for, and listened to Sandra tell me that it was going to be okay, that these things happen, that the important thing was that Daniel and I had each other, that maybe, she said, pausing the way people do when they want to make sure you understand the weight of what they're about to say, maybe this was an opportunity, a chance for me to step back, reassess. She looked at Daniel when she said it, not at me, at him. I smiled. I said thank you for the pot roast. I did not say what I knew, which was that I had owned the building she was sitting in for 4 years, and that her rent check came to my LLC every first of the month, and that she had never once connected the name on the lease to the woman her son had married. My name is Nora Vance. I'm 36 years old. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a house my parents rented until I was 12, when my father's act gave out and my mother picked up a second job at a dry cleaner, and they bought a small place on Elm Street with a mortgage that scared them for 20 years. I watched my mother do math at the kitchen table the way some people do crossword puzzles, carefully, privately, like the numbers might bite if she looked away. She was good at it. She taught me to be good at it too. I moved to Nashville when I was 24 for a job in commercial real estate analytics. Not glamorous, not the kind of thing people described interestingly at dinner parties. I ran numbers on properties, assessed yield potential, wrote reports that other people used to make decisions. I was good at it in the same quiet way my mother was good at her math. I didn't talk about it much. It was work, it paid well. And over time, slowly, carefully, the way my mother had taught me things that mattered were built. I started buying small properties first. A duplex in East Nashville, 2017, bought with a down payment I'd been assembling for 3 years. A 4-unit on Gallatin Pike, 2019. A commercial strip in Murfreesboro, 2020, when prices dipped and everyone else was scared and I had enough reserves to not be. I held everything under an LLC I'd formed in 2016, a name I'd chosen deliberately, something neutral, something that didn't announce itself. VN Property Holdings. 4 letters that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know to look. I met Daniel at a friend's wedding in 2018. He was funny and warm and the kind of man who remembered what you'd ordered the first time you went to a restaurant together and surprised you with it 6 months later. He was a high school history teacher. He loved his students in the sincere, non-performative way that's rarer than it sounds. He was not good with money, not in the way that meant reckless, just in the way that meant he didn't think about it much, didn't need to, trusted that things would work out. We were different in that way. It never mattered. We got married in 2020, small, outdoor, 17 people, his family and mine on opposite ends of a rented yard in October. Sandra wore a dress that was almost but not quite the same color as mine, which I noticed and filed away and chose not to make a thing of. His father, Robert, was quieter than Sandra, a retired electrician with a dry sense of humor and the habit of agreeing with his wife in public, and then catching my eye sideways in a way that said, privately, I know. I liked Robert. I still do. Sandra was harder. She was not cruel, not exactly. She never said anything I could point to directly and call it a thing. It was more like every interaction had a small weight added to it, a hesitation before she said my name, a way of asking about my job that made it sound like a polite inquiry about a hobby, a pattern of addressing the future of her son's household as though I were a guest in it rather than a co-architect. She was not a villain. She was something harder to name. She was a woman who had organized her life around being the most important person in her son's, and I had shown up and complicated that arrangement, and she had decided quietly and without negotiation not to adjust. I noticed it early. I didn't say much. Daniel saw it sometimes, and we talked about it the way you talk about weather, acknowledging it, not knowing what to do about it, moving on. His family was close. Sandra and Robert lived 20 minutes from us. Sunday dinners were a rhythm that predated me, and I'd stepped into it rather than been invited, which is its own kind of dynamic. I tried. I brought things. I asked questions. I learned that Sandra took her coffee with oat milk after 4 p.m. and regular cream before it. A detail so specific I only know it because I was paying attention, because paying attention was the only tool I had. The job I lost was at the firm where I'd worked for 11 years. It wasn't a scandal, no performance issue, no conflict. The firm was acquired, the acquiring company had redundant roles, and mine was one of them. I was given 8 weeks notice, a severance package that was genuinely decent, a letter of recommendation from my director that was 4 paragraphs long and used the word exceptional twice. I was not panicking. I had runway. I had income from the properties that covered our mortgage and then some. I had leads from 3 firms that had reached out in the past year, 2 of which I'd turned down because I hadn't needed to take them. I told Daniel the night it happened, sitting on the back porch with a glass of wine. Matter of fact, here's what happened. Here's where we are. Here's what I think we do next. He was upset on my behalf in the sweet way he got about things that worried him. I told him honestly that we were fine. He believed me because I'd never given him a reason not to. He told his mother the next day. I don't know exactly what he said. What I know is that by that evening, Sandra had texted me a message that was 7 sentences long and contained the phrase thinking of you twice and the phrase these things happen once and a question, tucked at the end like it was casual, about whether we thought about adjusting our housing situation given the circumstances. I read it 3 times. I wrote back thank you. I did not elaborate. right. The dinner was 2 weeks later. Sandra presented it as a family meal, just getting together, nothing special. Robert called Daniel to confirm the time and mentioned, with the particular care of a man delivering information he's been asked to deliver, that Sandra had made the pot roast. The pot roast was significant. It was the meal she made for occasions. Daniel's birthday, the first time I'd come to Sunday dinner, the night Pete and Renee announced their pregnancy. The pot roast was Sandra communicating something she wasn't going to say out loud. I knew when I walked in. Aunt Carol was already there, which she usually wasn't on a Sunday. Pete and Renee were dressed slightly better than usual. The table was set with cloth napkins. Sandra had her hair done. There was a card on the side table that I clocked immediately. Cream envelope, handwritten, my name on the front in Sandra's looping script. I sat down. I ate the pot roast, which was, as always, genuinely good. I listened to Sandra tell me that every setback was just a setup for a comeback, which was a phrase I was fairly certain she'd seen on a tea towel. I listened to Aunt Carol say that her friend Barb had gone through something similar and ended up teaching yoga, which she seemed to intend as comfort. I listened to Pete say that the market was rough right now, with the confident vagueness of a man who worked in insurance and considered himself financially aware. I listened to Renee say nothing while nodding supportively, which was Renee's specialty. Sandra brought out the card and slid it across the table to me. Everyone watched. I opened it. Inside, in Sandra's handwriting, it said that family was the most important thing and that material setbacks were just that, setbacks, and that she hoped Daniel and I knew that they were always there. Underneath her signature, in smaller writing, she had written, and I am reading this correctly, "You are always welcome here, as long as you need." I looked at the card. I looked at Daniel, who was reading something in my expression and not quite tracking it. I looked at Sandra, who had folded her hands on the table with a careful satisfaction of someone who has just done something they've been planning. I said, "That is very kind, thank you." I put the card back in the envelope. I finished my sweet tea. I asked Robert about the woodworking project he'd mentioned the month before, a bookcase for Pete's kids, and he talked about it for 10 minutes with genuine enthusiasm, and everyone relaxed slightly because the moment had passed. But the moment had passed into me, not away. I drove home next to Daniel in the dark, watching the Nashville streets go by, and felt the particular stillness of a person who has just been handed someone's full opinion of them, gift-wrapped, and chose for the time being not to open it back. Here is what Sandra did not know. In 2019, Robert had mentioned, casually, during a Sunday dinner I was barely included in, that their landlord was selling the building they'd lived in for 12 years. A 4-unit on a quiet street in Brentwood, main floor unit, 2 bedrooms, a yard. They'd been there since Daniel was in high school. Sandra had cried briefly at the table when she mentioned it, which was the first and only time I'd ever seen her cry. She recovered quickly, called it an adjustment, said they'd find something. I was 2 months into the Gallatin Pike acquisition at the time. I had capital moving. I had a broker I trusted. I called him the next morning. The building was listed at $680,000. It needed some work, mechanicals mostly, a roof assessment, 1 unit with a deferred bathroom renovation. My broker had it inspected in 72 hours. I offered $651,000 cash, a number I'd calculated to close quickly without insulting the seller. It closed in 19 days. I set the rent on Robert and Sandra's unit at $1,350 a month, below market for Brentwood, a rate I chose deliberately, and for reasons I didn't examine too carefully at the time. The other 3 units I brought to market rate. The building covered its own costs, and then some within 8 months. I had their new lease processed through VN Property Holdings, handled by my property manager, a woman named Connie who communicated with tenants by email, and had the efficient neutrality of someone who understood that property management was logistics, not relationships. Sandra had signed the lease. Robert had co-signed. They had been tenants of mine for 4 years, and they had never known it, because the name on the documents was VN Property Holdings, not Nora Vance, and because it had not occurred to them to look. I did not plan the dinner to happen the way it happened. I want to say that clearly. I hadn't walked in with a scheme. I hadn't been waiting for a moment. What happened because Sandra gave me the card, and the card said, "You are always welcome here." And there was something about sitting in my tenant's dining room and being told I was welcome as long as I needed that moved something in me from still to not. 3 days after the dinner, Connie sent the quarterly newsletter to all VN Property Holdings tenants, the standard document, upcoming maintenance schedule, insurance renewal notice, contact information for repairs. At the bottom of the newsletter, as I'd asked her to add 2 days prior, was a brief note. It said, "VN Property Holdings is pleased to inform tenants of the Brentwood property that the owner will be transitioning to direct management as of the 1st of next month. Please direct all future communications to the owner, Nora Vance, at the contact information below." Connie sent it on a Tuesday at 9 a.m. By 9:47, I had a call from a number I didn't recognize, a Brentwood area code. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was Robert, his voice careful and measured in the way of a man who has just read something twice to make sure he understood it. "Nora, it's Robert. I think maybe we should talk." I called him back that afternoon. He picked up on the first ring. We were quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of 2 people who are both trying to figure out how to start. Then Robert said, "Slow, you own our building." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said, "since 2019. He was quiet again. Then he said, 4 years. 4 years, I said. He exhaled a long sound. He said, "Does Daniel know?" "No," I said, "not yet. I'm going to tell him tonight." Robert said, "Okay." Then, after a pause, he said, "Nora, why didn't you ever say anything?" I thought about it for a moment. I said, "Because it didn't come up, and then because too much time passed, and then because I wasn't sure how." He said, "And now?" "And now Sandra gave me a card? I said, telling me I was welcome in her home as long as I needed. Robert was quiet. Then he made a sound I hadn't heard from him before, somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely. He said, well, alright then. I told Daniel that evening. We were in the kitchen. I was making dinner, and I turned the burner down and told him the whole thing from the beginning. The listing in 2019, the closing, Connie's management, the rent figure, the 4 years. He stood in the kitchen doorway and listened without interrupting, which is something I'd always loved about him. The ability to hold a thing without reacting to it before he understood it. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, you've been their landlord for 4 years. I said, yes. He said, in the pity party. He stopped himself. He said, she wrote you a card. I said, yes. He looked at the ceiling the way he did when he was doing something internal and private. Then he said, she's going to be furious. She was. Sandra called the following morning. I know because Daniel told me she'd called him first at 7 a.m., which is the kind of hour you call your child when you are not processing something well. He talked to her for 40 minutes. I know roughly what was said because Daniel told me, sitting across from me at the breakfast table, that his mother felt blindsided and embarrassed, and that she'd used the word deceived, which he gently pointed out was complicated, given that deception implied intent, and the truth was that I'd simply never mentioned something that hadn't been asked. Sandra called me at noon. I answered. She said my name in the tone she reserved for moments she'd decided were confrontational. She said she felt like she'd been made a fool of. I said I understood why it felt that way. She said I should have told her, should have told Robert years ago. I said that was fair and that I wished I had. She said the card, Nora. She said I was trying to be supportive. I said I knew. She said then why? Her voice cracked on the word just slightly, the way voices do when the anger is sitting on top of something else. I said, Sandra, I said, I have been in your house for 4 years trying to be welcomed into your family. I brought the right things and remembered your coffee order and showed up every Sunday, and it was never quite enough. And I sat at your table last week and listened to everyone tell me my life needed managing while I was sitting in a building I own. I said, I'm not angry, but I am not someone who needs to be pitied. I never was. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, I didn't know that about you. I know. I said, that was also part of the problem. We talked for another 20 minutes. It wasn't resolved. Those things never resolve in a single conversation, but it shifted. Something in her voice moved from defended to something quieter, more uncertain. Before she hung up, she said, the rent. Are you going to? I said, the rent stays the same. She was quiet. She said, that's very... She didn't finish this sentence. I said I knew. Robert sent me a text that afternoon. It was 4 words. Good for you, Nora. I saved it. The months that followed were strange and slow and real in the way that things are when a dynamic that's been in place for years is asked to become something else. Sandra and I were not suddenly close. That would have been too clean, too simple. The kind of resolution that only happens in stories that don't respect the actual friction of people. But something changed in how she looked at me. The hesitation before my name, the way she'd angled her questions. It didn't disappear, but it moved. Became something more careful, more curious, less certain of what it knew. She asked me once at a Sunday dinner 4 months later what I was working on. Not the polite version of the question, the version that precedes not really listening to the answer. The actual version. She put her fork down and looked at me. I told her about the Murfreesboro Strip, the new tenant I was negotiating with, a regional bakery chain, good credit, long lease, reliable. She listened. She asked a question I hadn't expected, something about the lease terms, whether I'd locked in annual increases. I said yes, 3% standard. She nodded. She said, smart. It was one word. It sat differently than I expected. I think about the version of myself who drove home from that first pity dinner, quiet in the car beside Daniel, watching Nashville go by. She hadn't said anything she could regret. She hadn't made a scene. She'd sat in her tenant's dining room and accepted a card that told her she was welcome in her own building, and she'd said thank you, and she'd left. She wasn't weak. She was waiting. Not for revenge. That word is too hot, too intentional. Waiting is the wrong word too. She was just still. The way water is still before you understand its depth. Sandra had a category for me when I walked into her son's life. I was the outside woman, the variable, the one who hadn't been there for the original story and could therefore never quite be trusted with a sequel. She had assigned me a level of the building, and I had smiled and carried trays and shown up on time and never quite bit and never quite said why. The newsletter was not revenge. It was a correction. I am Nora Vance. I run numbers on properties. I bought a building in 2019 to help a family that didn't know I was helping them. I stayed quiet about it for 4 years because it didn't come up, and then because too much time passed, and then because I was waiting, without knowing I was waiting, for someone to hand me a card that said I was welcome as long as I needed. I own 6 properties now. The Brentwood building is still in the portfolio. Sandra's rent has not increased. I don't say that to be generous. I say it because it's true, and truth is the kind of thing that matters more when no one's watching. Connie still handles maintenance. I handle the lease renewals myself. Last month, Sandra asked if I'd look at a property listing her friend had sent her. Someone from church thinking about selling a condo. She texted me the Zillow link. She asked what I thought. I looked at it. I texted back my honest assessment, 3 sentences, the numbers, the location, the issue with the comparable sales in that zip code. She texted back, what would you offer? I told her. She said, you know what you're talking about. I said, I've been doing this for 12 years. She didn't respond right away. Then she sent a single message that I read twice and then put my phone down and looked out the window for a while. She said, I should have asked sooner. I don't think Sandra and I will ever be the easy kind of close. The years have a shape to them that doesn't fully unbend, but I think we are becoming something more honest than what we were, which is its own kind of closeness. The kind that knows it had to be earned. I made my mother's hot roast for Sunday dinner 2 weeks ago. Sandra watched me from the kitchen kitchen doorway while I was finishing it. She said, "Where did you learn that?" I said, "My mom." She said, "It smells the same." I said, "She had a good recipe." Sandra said, "It does." She picked up her coffee, the one with oat milk, and went back to the table. Daniel caught my eye from the hallway. He mouthed the words, "Who are you?" I mouthed back, "I've been here the whole time." He laughed quiet so only I could hear it. Outside the house that used to scare my mother with its mortgage sat finished and paid for in another city, on a street I still know by memory. She built something careful and real from numbers on a kitchen table. I watched her do it. I learned. I built something too. I just didn't make a lot of noise about it. That was always going to be enough. Thanks for watching.